Hi, welcome to week 14 of Bring It Home. I'm Pastor Hansen. We begin this week with the lesson of King Hezekiah Prays. King Hezekiah was facing from a human point of view, insurmountable threat to his safety, to the safety of his people, as the king of the Assyrians, Sennacherib, was threatening them with overwhelming force. Initially, Hezekiah tried to make peace with him, offered up tributes of gold and silver, and yet King Sennacherib persisted. And he specifically challenged Hezekiah, saying, "Who is there that's able to protect you? Who is there that's able to protect your people? Certainly not your God." Yet Hezekiah knew that God could protect him, protect his people, and so he prayed and asked God to deliver him, and God did. God destroyed the armies of Sennacherib, sent him back home, and he was defeated not even by soldiers, not by Hezekiah's armies, but rather by his own sons. And so we see the deliverance that God worked for his people, not merely by giving them the leg up in a battle, but rather by God himself fighting for them and by evil undoing itself. That this wicked king was destroyed by his own wickedness, by the sons that he had raised up in his own image. Our second reading is that of King Josiah. King Josiah began to rule over Judah when he was 8 years old, and then in the 18th year of his reign, he set about restoring the temple of God, and as the people worked to restore the temple, they found a lost book of the Bible. We don't know exactly which book of the Bible or books of the Bible this lost book was. It could have been the whole of the law of God, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. What we do know is that because this book of the law was missing, because the people were not following it, they had even ceased to celebrate the feast of the Passover. Perhaps this means that at a minimum, the lost part of the Word of God included the book of Exodus. And the fact that God's people had stopped celebrating this most important of feasts, the feasts of God's deliverance for them from slavery in Egypt, speaks to the true depth of sin. That sin is not simply about us breaking rules, but it is about forgetting who God is and what he has done for us. The rebellion of God's people was not simply a large number of failures, but a total forsaking of the God who had delivered them, the God who had called them to be his own. In our third lesson, God calls the prophet Jeremiah. He calls Jeremiah, first of all, as a young man. That is to say, in Jeremiah, we see a clear picture that it is not the man who speaks the word of God that is important, but the word of God that he speaks, which matters. And the word that this prophet speaks is a hard word. Jeremiah is given the unenviable task of announcing to God's people, to the God's people who have forsaken the worship of their God, the coming doom of their exile. People, of course, don't want to hear this message. His own people tried to kill him. He felt the pain and burden of announcing this coming judgment upon the people, and yet had nothing but scorn and hatred from them in return. And while Jeremiah has this unenviable task, he also has words of grace and mercy from God. In the midst of all of the announcement of the coming suffering and judgment upon the people, Jeremiah also has words from God like this: "I have loved you with an everlasting love, therefore I have continued my faithfulness to you." These verses are quite popular. We quote them when we are in our own times of trouble. It is especially comforting and encouraging when we remember the context in which they were given. These words and promises from God were not given to a prophet who had all kinds of happy news where, yes, these days are hard, but they're only going to get better. No, Jeremiah was a prophet who was announcing things are bad and things are going to get a whole lot worse. And that is precisely why these good and faithful promises of God are there. To say, yes, the days are dark and getting darker, and yet I will continue my faithfulness. My steadfast love for you endures. Although everything around you is collapsing, my faithfulness, my love, does not. And in our fourth lesson this week, we hear of when that exile of God's people came to pass. In the Know the Bible Now, it speaks of both the exile or end of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom that had split off from the rest of God's people after the days of Solomon the king. And then also of the exile of Judah, of those Israelites who had remained faithful to God in the southern kingdom. When the exile takes place, the temple that Solomon had built, is destroyed. This destruction of Solomon's temple marks, if you will, the end of an era. It marks the final end of that kingdom that God had begun with David, continued through his son Solomon, continued down through kings faithful and unfaithful throughout the generations. And so now as the kingdom sits in ruins, the temple sits in ruins, God's promises of that king who will sit on the throne of David forever, God's promise of the temple where he dwells with his people, is left waiting to be fulfilled. And so from this time forward, through the mouths of the prophets that God sends, the emphasis is continually on that coming salvation of the one who will come, who will be the Son of David, who will restore the temple, the one who will once again establish God's throne upon earth, where he rules over his people with love and mercy. And so in our fifth final lesson this week, we hear of God's promises to the exiles, especially those promises that he makes through the prophet Ezekiel. The book of the prophet Ezekiel has many parallels to the book of Revelation. Just as the book of Revelation will describe the temple, the new Jerusalem that God has prepared for us in heaven, so also it is that Ezekiel describes a temple which is fulfilled not finally in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple that occurs when the exiles return home, but rather in that rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of God's people, which occurs in his Son, Jesus. And so the prophet Ezekiel speaks not only of a temple being built, but of God taking the hearts of stone that are in his people and giving them instead living hearts, hearts of flesh. That God will not merely rebuild a building, but rebuild his people, strengthen their hearts. Ezekiel is also the prophet where we have that marvelous story of the valley full of dry bones that God gives life to and breathes his spirit into and raises them up. And so even while God's people are in exile, evermore the picture is being made more clear, the picture that will be brought to light at the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.